Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next three speakers. And they are speaking on the topic of the roots of institutional biases in service delivery, which for the individuals among us who work directly with individuals will be, I'm sure, something that we will really take to heart. So our first speaker will be Allen Mankewich. He is the Community Relations and Government Relations Director for Independent Living Resource Center in Winnipeg. Our second will be Margaret Bryans, who said that I should not read her bio because she is vain enough to do it herself in her 10 minutes. And then third will be Jeneen Derrickson. She's a social worker and she is an advocate with the First Nations Family Advocate Office. So, Allen, we'll start with you.
Thanks, everyone. Great to be here today. I didn't really know how to structure my talk, so I apologize in advance if this sounds a little rambly. I guess one thing I can start off by addressing is, in terms of biases and things like that, is the fact that we moved our podium down to the floor level today because the hotel does not have a ramp for people like me to get onto the stage. So basically what that tells me is that they don't expect people like me to show up at conferences and things like that and be able to participate. So I think that's a good jumping off point for this discussion. In terms of the roots of institutional biases in service delivery, I would say that those biases are rooted in the views of the wider society in terms of how they view people with disabilities. The stigma towards disability, even the word disability itself, people are afraid to say it. I don't have a problem identifying as a disabled individual, but you'll see organizations and groups bend themselves into a pretzel to avoid saying the word disability. You hear all kinds of euphemisms like people of all abilities, people with special abilities. I don't know what special abilities I have. Maybe I have some superpowers I don't know about, but I say that as a joke, but I think it is a serious thing. We are afraid to acknowledge disability and the role it plays in our society, and as a result, there's shame towards disability, by people with disabilities themselves. There's pity towards us by others, which manifests itself in weird policy and program delivery systems. We're expected to be brave or courageous for the way we live our lives instead of just being seen as, regular people. So I think all of that sort of contributes towards institutional biases in service delivery in some way. In terms of service provision, another thing that our community is wary of is charitable organizations delivering services and supports. I don't think my rights as a human being should be dependent on the willingness of other people to donate, a few dollars to a charity that supports people with disabilities. I think certain things should be just inherently supported. In terms of things like institutionalization of people with disabilities were traditionally warehoused in large-scale institutions, 50 or 100 years ago, even today, because we don't know how to incorporate them into the community. So even today, we still have places like Manitoba Developmental Center, which is currently has a class action lawsuit filed against it for some of the atrocities they've committed against people with disabilities. And our home care system itself, some people might think home care is a system for, older people, but there's people my age who can access home care if they need support for some of their day-to-day activities. But with the home care system, you're limited to 56 hours a week of support, per week of support. So if you need support over and above that, your option is to go into an institution, which diminishes your quality of life, takes you away from your friends and family potentially, and other services and supports in the community. Housing is another area where institutional biases affect people with disabilities. We continue to build homes the same way we've built them for 100 or 200 years, 5 steps to get in the door. If you're looking for a home or expect to be invited over to a friend's place at some point in your life, those are opportunities that people with disabilities just don't have. It's another way where sort of our institutional practices are ingrained in a way that affect people with disabilities. Just the other day, there was a situation in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where they rejected a group home for people with disabilities in a new development because they felt it would affect their property values. And so even today, we're seeing, those attitudes that we have that people with disabilities are scary or dangerous or whatever, and that affects our ability to be included in the community. Similarly, with things like employment, we're not expected to be in certain places. In addition to my work at the ILRC, I also work at MTS Center. I take tickets at Jets games and concerts. And a couple of years ago, I was working in an event. Someone gave me their ticket. I scanned it. And as I gave it back to them, they said, "Oh, it's nice they found a job you can do." So those are, some of the attitudes that the general public has. I'm not saying everyone thinks that way, but those attitudes do contribute to the biases in other service delivery areas. In terms of the medical system, there's a lot of ableism in the medical system, in our education systems. People have to fight for accommodations in our education system. That's an ongoing dialogue in the media. In terms of the medical system, I'm in my late 30s and I have no idea how much I weigh because I don't generally go to healthcare facilities that have a scale where I can weigh myself. So these are all things that contribute to potentially public health issues for people with disabilities as well. So I don't think I have much time left. So I'll just close it by saying the way we value people in our society is reflected in how our service delivery systems are designed, and that definitely still has a huge impact for people with disabilities. Thank you.
All right, I think I'm going to get started. Okay, we can go to the first slide there. Cool. So my name is Margaret, and I've been taught over the years by the people that I've connected with about how important land acknowledgements are. And we did one at the very beginning. And I've also been taught by lots of people recently about how white people do a bad job of land acknowledgements because we just read off a piece of paper and then we don't actually do anything. And so I work with young Indigenous people right now who are like, land acknowledgements have to go with action. And so I want to just talk a little bit about, for me, how important as a settler it's been to connect to land via understanding treaties, relationships with other Indigenous people, and how that is how I hold my government to account, and how we talk about these things openly, and that the ways that I try to work in health, which is what I do, are about how we dismantle colonization and racism in healthcare. And I've also learned, I always feel like a tiny, like the tiny little like fish like starting to like flop out of the water in that like evolution-y kind of thing. That is how I feel all the time when I talk about this stuff, because it takes me a really long time to clue into things. So I've worked in Indigenous organizations for a long time, and it took me a very long time to figure out why people were asking, where are you from? All the time, like, where are you from? Who are your people? And I was like, oh, people are just really interested in where people come from, like where they live. It took me a long time as a settler to understand about how that question is actually about connection, and about how we connect to each other, how we connect to the land. And so I'm hopeful that we are going to be able to chat a little bit about how we can also connect through health, and how white people can think about how we're doing things. Okay, we can scooch over. So I am vain enough to introduce my own self. I have a picture that's basically full of me. And the reason that I have that picture up is partly because of vanity, but also partly because of how important it is for people to know who I am, what my values and ethics are. So my name is Margaret. I'm a nurse. I'm a mom. I am queer. I live with my partner and our kid and a bunch of other queer family, depending on the day. And I've spent the bulk of my life working and volunteering in harm reduction work, which is working with people who use drugs, basically. And I've worked in acute care settings, I've worked in community, and I've interfaced with acute care quite a lot. And so I care about people who use drugs, because most of the people in my life use drugs. And I started learning about root causes of institutional bias, mostly doing harm reduction work, and learning about drug war policy, and in particular how drug war policy targets people of color almost exclusively. We all think that there's reasons that certain drugs are illegal or not illegal, and it is almost entirely related to to racism. And I'm also a queer auntie, so I have lots of younger queer people in my life who call me up and ask me questions that I'm definitely not qualified to answer. But I give advice anyways, because I've been taught to do that. And so basically what I want to do with you folks today is just talk a little bit about institutional racism and colonization in healthcare, which is a weird thing for a white person to do. But I think it's a strange, so we'll sort of talk a little bit. When I was asked to talk about what institutionalized racism and colonization and healthcare, how those things all intersect, I was talking to Shahina Siddiqui on the phone, and I know her because I've heard her speak many times, but she does not know me. And I was like, I just need to tell you that I'm a white settler. Like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And she's like, yeah, we need white people to say these things out loud too. And which I was just talking to Kim and saying, like, man, that is an intense situation that we're all in, where we need white people to say things that people of color, Indigenous people, Black people have been saying out loud, very loudly, for a really long time. That in order for that to be heard, I have to say it kind of in a crappy way, because I'm not good. That's not my context. That's not my life. I know what it's like to be fat in the world. I know what it's like to be queer in the world, but I have a million blinders about race and colonization in particular. So that's what I'm gonna sort of try to do. So just to be clear, a couple of things. One is that if I say something and you're like, wow, that's really smart, that is 100% not me. I didn't make that up. Somebody else smarter, somebody who is a person of color said that, and I heard it, and I'm saying it again. So if anything comes up that's smart, you can be sure that's not me. If I say something that is stupid or racist, that's all me. That's 100% me. And so that is the caveat. This little conversation that we're going to have from my end, just to be clear about who this talk is for, who I'm talking to other white settlers. So if you're a person of color, if you're Indigenous, if you're Black, this is your moment to like check your Facebook, or like go to the bathroom, or like catch your breath, or like, I don't know, start a revolution, whatever that looks like. You don't have to be here for this, and that is very reasonable. The other thing is that I just want to be clear that I'm not an expert at all. I think the reason that I'm here is because I'm mostly just kind of mouthy and willing to talk about how my identity as a white settler has like gotten people into trouble and how it's been a problem in healthcare and what that looks like. So let's just scooch to the next sort of slide. So I just want to acknowledge that I love this slide where it just says there's so much strength and healing, and I believe that, and I think that this is like, 10 minutes is a hard 10 minutes because it feels like a strange thing to be talking about how we as white people need to stop being racist or acknowledge our racism, think about how the impacts of colonization in healthcare, given what's happening, and also it is the perfect time to be thinking about it because the things that we do, these small tiny moments in time where we have our blinders on, where we're not thinking about how what we're doing is impacted by race, how what we're doing is not impacted by colonization, those are the moments where we do and say things that perpetuate, that sort of like are that tiny little beginning stage where we go up to the point where we're having media coming in here talking to us about more people who've been massacred. And so that is why we do this kind of, that's why I sort of I'm glad to be here, and also it feels like a strange thing for me. All right, let me just check in here. Yeah, okay, sorry. The reason I have it on my computer is because I had no ink in my printer yesterday. But not talking about things like how we are racist, how we benefit from colonization and white supremacy is a harm. It's a deep harm, and it is particularly harmful for people who are trying to access healthcare and for people who are working in healthcare. All right. We can scooch a little bit to the next one, I think. So this thing says defining racism, but I'm not going to do that. I actually just want to get into talking a little bit about healthcare, and I want to start by talking about how racism is about impact, not intent. So I have that little cartoon of the person walking by and then accidentally stepping on someone's toe, and then the person who got hurt says ouch, and then the other person's like, knock it off. Like, I didn't mean to step on your toe. And I think that when we're thinking about healthcare, that is a common response that people are, healthcare, we didn't mean to do that. We didn't mean for it to feel that way, but it does anyways. And so that's the place where it feels like we as like healthcare providers can be starting to think about how we can intervene when that kind of comment and talk comes up. So nothing in healthcare really is, some of it is overtly racist. I have for sure heard people say overtly racist things or accompany people to the hospital because of the fear that people experience when they go there and because of how unsafe it is. But also that structure of indifference, that sort of sense of indifference that comes up for people in healthcare is another thing that we need to be thinking about. All right, I think we can scooch to the next one, which is, okay. So I just wanted to quickly just talk about the fact that we've been talking about racism in healthcare for a million flippin' years. And there's a bunch of, you just need to Google racism healthcare. It is understood that healthcare systems are racist and colonial. That is how we started, that is how we continue. These are like just some of the things that, conversations that have been happening in Canada only, but there's tons of evidence that supports that reinforces the fact that the healthcare systems that we're in are racist. And as somebody who wants to be part of healing my community and the people that I love, that is not okay with me. And my guess is it's not okay with you folks either. But for sure, we talk about the systems as being the problem rather than acknowledging that we are part of those systems. So I'm a nurse, I work in healthcare, I benefit from an education system that targets who I am and my identity as a white settler. The training that I received as a nurse there, I remember moments in time where the ways that we talked about Indigenous people, the ways that we talked about people of color, the way I was taught were not, were racist. They're not acceptable. And yet that is what is the experience of most of us who are going through healthcare. And we have to actually speak up about that as settlers and as healthcare providers who are white. We have a responsibility to say those things out loud to folks. And so when folks say to me, it's nurses, often too, nurses, we love to make a plan for things. We love to know exactly what to do to fix something. And often for some reason, I mean, we do a pretty good job of fixing healthcare stuff in lots of different ways. We can fix a broken leg, we can do all kinds of stuff, but somehow when it comes to thinking about racism within the system or colonization within the system, we like throw our hands up and are like, well, we don't know what to do. And I'm like, man, like I've started programs, I've kept a kid alive, and surely I can think of some things that I could do to interrupt racism in healthcare, or at least I could Google it. So these are the things that I kind of come up for me when I'm thinking about health and healthcare. And we can go on to the next slide because I have 1 minute left. And I never give examples because this is the other thing that I think we need to think about, and in healthcare in particular, is that we shouldn't need to hear about people's pain. So how many people have ever either experienced racism in healthcare or like impacts, like sort of like colonial white supremacy in healthcare, or have heard a story about it? Just throw your hands up. Like if all we needed to do was like tell a story about how things were, we would have already solved this issue. So we don't need to talk about people's pain to be able to actually address the ways that we're thinking about health and healing. And I think the ways that we do that, I'm gonna maybe just leave it at this slide and say that this morning when Dr. Retta was talking about how his mom was like, oh, like, get busy mending hearts. Like, I love that she talked to a psychiatrist who did medical school and who works on brains, that she knows intrinsically that what healing is about is mending hearts. And I think that is like a super powerful place to think about how we as settlers can work with each other to heal ourselves, because we have a lot of work to do around mending our hearts so that we can actually engage in a way that's meaningful for ourselves, but also for our communities, for people of color and Indigenous people. And I think I will just leave it there for now. Thanks.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm very soft-spoken. But my name's Jeneen, and I was given a spirit name about 2.5 years ago, which is Northern Lights Dancing Woman. I don't know how to say that in my language. And I'll speak to that a little bit in a minute. I currently work for the First Nations Family Advocate Office as a social worker, advocating with families that are currently involved with the Child and Family Services system, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in regards to the roots of institutional biases in service delivery. But I don't even want to say bias at this point. I think it's institutional oppression within the Child and Family Services. We, as a people, have suffered from years of colonization. I'm not 100% sure how informed everybody is on what colonization is, so I'd like to kind of cover just a little bit about that. And Europeans had come over to what they call the Western lands, and the reason why people refer it as Western society is because Europeans considered themselves the center of the universe. So we were to the west of them, and that's where we have coined this term, Western ways. And these lands were fruitful and bountiful with many resources, and the Hudson's Bay Company was a booming thing for Europeans. So they settled here, and the reality is that they didn't know how to live here and survive. So in other histories, most people were killed off in a genocide, whereas they couldn't do that to our people. So they managed to learn with us and try to live with us, but eventually we were colonized and oppressed in many ways. So there was things like the Indian Act that came out, and for our people who are already living here were then labeled who they could be as an Indian, and if you were deserving of that title, which led into, as times followed forward, the 60s scoop, which was when the government had said that, you know, because of residential schooling, which I'm sure people are very familiar with, I'm not sure, but they had taken their children from their homes, put them into Christian schools, and then when they went back home, the government had deemed their parents not able to parent. So residential schoolings were kind of getting a little bit of a negative connotation to them. So then they did the 60s scoop, where they took their children and put them into family services. So now brings us to the current system that we have today, which is child and family services. So there's a lot of public conversation around that lately, but there's a long-term generational effect of how the government has continually oppressed our people who live here. And they didn't necessarily agree to the way we lived. We were a matriarch society, and our government was run differently. They tried writing treaties, but it was misunderstood, and conversations around that are constantly being battled at a government level. But we've started a public conversation to try and change that and begin this reconciliation, but it's very new, and the reality is that it's a challenge to Eurocentrically educated Canadians to develop these anti-oppressive teachings, because we're asking Canadians to unlearn and be, sensitize their views of minority cultures. And it's not an easy thing to do, but we're somewhat working towards that on a public level. We have, as a people, developed a women's council that is being a little bit more recognized. Cora Morgan spoke to the grassroots levels of changes that have been coming about. With my office, the First Nations Family Advocate Office was developed by two women who recognized that the system was failing tons of children in care, and they were losing this value for life, and we were seeing children fall through the cracks and get stuck into the justice system. Most men or young boys will go into the justice system, and then our women will end up back into the child and family services agencies because they bear children. We have a very low success rate of children who age out of care and become successful. I thankfully am one of them. I was a child in care myself, and I grew up with the effects of colonization. So on my mother's side, I am fourth generation of colonization. My grandmother is Inuit, and she was actually part of Canadian sovereignty. So the government not only came and colonized Indigenous people at the lower end in comparison to the border in the US, but also in Nunavut. So they needed people to live further up into the scattered islands that you see on a map, live and be buried there. So they actually took a group of Inuit people and moved them and relocated them to these islands so that no one else could claim these lands as Canadian. So that was my grandmother, which is only 3 generations away. And then they also, so there's a public apology that went out about that as well. So the government has recognized some wrongdoings, but the public conversation hasn't quite changed yet. There's an acknowledgement, but like I said earlier, changing that frame of mind has been a little bit difficult. And so I'm really proud to be working with the First Nations Family Advocate Office at a grassroots level, because we're not mandated and to follow government standards. We are able to work outside of the box a little bit, and we service families that need the help at their level. And I'm really honored to be able to do that, because I lost my roots being a child in care myself and not knowing where I came from. And I'm thankful to get to know my father a little bit, but my mother passed away without me being able to get to know her. And I think that happens a lot with the children in care that are aging out right now. They are completely disconnected from their families, which is what they did with the 60 scoop and residential schooling. So the practice is very similar to how this has been going on for years of colonization, but there hasn't been a ton of change. But I do foresee some changes in the future and some public conversation happening. There's some stereotypes and labels that are attached to children in care, that are poor, Indigenous, troubled, deviant. It's just they don't have a lot of positive feelings being in the system. And I think a public conversation around that needs to be acknowledged. We have, not to take away from the hardships that people, let's say, with cancer or MS, that what they go through with that, but they're seen as deserving of help, and that hardship in their life is life-changing. But we have these children in care and these families who have to go through many challenges, but they're not seen as deserving for help, because it seems to be that it's labeled as a choice to be in care, that your family was they could have avoided that from happening, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. So I'm gonna end it there because my timing is up, but I'd just like to acknowledge that there's some public conversation changing in the media, and I hope to foresee some reconciliation with the Child and Family Services moving forward.